somewhere over the Aegean Sea. On the morning of August 14th, 2005, a Boeing 737 was flying itself to its own funeral. The autopilot was engaged. The altitude was 34,000 feet. The weather was clear. The aircraft was mechanically sound. The fuel tanks were full. Every system on board was functioning exactly as designed. And every single person on that plane was already dying. 115 passengers, 6 crew members, a German captain with nearly 9,000 hours on the 737, a Cypriot first officer with over 7,000 hours of experience. Between them, almost 25,000 hours of accumulated flight time. All of them unconscious, some of them already dead. The aircraft flew on without them. It entered the holding pattern for Athens International Airport and began circling. It completed one circuit. Then another, then another. It flew in those circles for 70 minutes, this machine full of the dead and the dying, waiting obediently for instructions that would never come. When Greek Air Force F-16 fighters finally intercepted the jet and pulled alongside to investigate, we suffer from those side leeches. The pilot of the lead fighter peered through the cockpit glass of the 737 and saw something he would later say he could not forget. The first officer was slumped forward over the controls. The captain's seat was empty. Several passengers visible through the windows were sitting motionless in their seats wearing oxygen masks, like mannequins arranged for a display that nobody was running anymore. The fighter pilot tried to make radio contact. No response. He pulled his jet alongside and flashed his lights. No response. He fired warning flares. No response. Then, at 11:49 in the morning, 2 hours and 42 minutes after the last recorded communication from the flight deck, something moved inside the cockpit of the dead airplane. A door opened, a figure entered, a man sat down in the captain's seat. He was not a pilot. He was a flight attendant. His name was Andreas Prodromou. He was 26 years old, and he was the only conscious person left on Helios Airways Flight 522. And in the next 14 minutes, he would make the most desperate and hopeless attempt to save 121 lives in the history of aviation. This is the story of the ghost plane. This is the story of how a switch left in the wrong position by a tired ground engineer on a summer morning in Cyprus killed 121 people over Greece. This is the story of warnings that sounded and were not heard, of systems that failed, not by malfunctioning but by working exactly as designed, and of a young man with a pilot's license but no type rating who sat down in a dead cockpit over Athens and tried, alone and in the final minutes of his life, to bring a planned load of corpses safely home. This is Helios Airways Flight 522, Part 1, the airline at the edge. To understand what happened on August 14th, 2005, you have to understand the world that produced it. Helios Airways was a Cypriot budget carrier founded in 1998 and based at Larnaca International Airport on the southern coast of Cyprus. It was, by any reasonable measure, a small airline trying to compete in a market that was becoming increasingly brutal. The aircraft designated for Flight 522 on the morning of August 14th was a Boeing 737-300 series, registered 5 Bravo Delta Bravo Yankee. It had been built in 1997, had served briefly with Deutsche Bahn, and had been leased to Helios in April 2004. It was 7.5 years old, recently maintained, and in the kind of mechanical condition that the aviation industry regards as ordinary and unremarkable. In the weeks before the accident, however, 5 Bravo Delta Bravo Yankee had been developing a reputation among the crews who flew it. Passengers had complained about unusual cold aboard the aircraft. Crew members had noticed what they described as abnormal air conditioning behavior. The aircraft's environmental control system had been inspected 7 times in the weeks leading up to August 14th systems. 7 separate inspections. 7 times engineers had looked at the pressurization and air conditioning systems. 7 times to 2, Captain times the aircraft had been cleared and returned to service. None of those 7 inspections had identified the underlying problem. Or, more precisely, the problem that would kill 121 people was not a defect in the mechanical system at all. It was a switch, a single switch, A switch that had been set to the wrong position and not returned to the correct one. But we are getting ahead of the story. Part 2, the night before. On the evening of August 13th, 2005, 5 Bravo Delta Bravo Yankee landed at Larnaca after a flight from London Heathrow. It had been a long day for the aircraft. During that inbound flight from London, the cabin crew had noticed something wrong with the right aft service door. They described it in the technical log as follows: the aft service door seal. Freezes and hard bangs are heard during flight. This was not, in itself, an emergency. Door seal issues are relatively common in pressurized aircraft, caused by the extreme temperature differential between the cabin environment and the outside air at altitude. The crew made the log entry. The aircraft landed at Larnaca just after 1:30 in the morning, and the ground engineers went to work. The man responsible for the inspection that night was a ground engineer named Alan Irwin, an experienced maintenance professional employed by Helios. Irwin and his colleagues conducted a visual inspection of the door, looked at the seals, found nothing alarming, and then moved on to the second part of the inspection, a pressurization leak check. Now we need to stop and understand what a pressurization leak check is, because this is where the story turns. We suffer from those slit-eyed leeches. A commercial aircraft like the Boeing 737 maintains cabin pressure at a comfortable level by continuously pumping outside air into the fuselage through the environmental control system. At cruise altitude, the outside air pressure is far too low for human survival, so the aircraft keeps the cabin pressurized at the equivalent of roughly 8,000 feet, uncomfortable but survivable. We suffer from those slit-eyed chiz. The pressurization system is controlled by a panel in the cockpit, and the key switch on that panel can be set to one of 3 positions: automatic, which is where it should be for normal flight standby, which is a backup mode, or manual, which puts the entire pressurization system under direct crew control. In normal operations, the switch is always in automatic. Always. To conduct a pressurization leak check on the ground without running the aircraft's engines, it is necessary to set the switch to manual. This allows the engineers to pressurize the cabin using ground equipment while they look for leaks around the doors and seals. It is a routine procedure performed correctly thousands of times every day at airports around the world. The procedure requires, at its conclusion, that the switch be returned to automatic before the aircraft is released for service. Alan Irwin finished his pressurization leak check. He found no significant leaks in the door seal. He completed his work and signed the aircraft's technical log, releasing 5 Bravo Delta Bravo Yankee for the next flight. He did not return the pressurization switch to automatic. Investigators later concluded, after examining the non-volatile memory of the aircraft's systems, that the pressurization control switch was in the manual position not just at the time of the accident, but throughout the entire fatal flight, from the moment of takeoff to the moment of impact. From the moment of takeoff to the moment automatic. It had been in manual from the moment Irwin finished his leak check, through the rest of the night, through the pre-flight checks of the crew, through the takeoff, and through every minute of the 2 hours and 42 minutes that preceded the crash. Nobody noticed. Not Irwin, who apparently forgot to complete the final step of his own procedure. Not the next crew to fly the aircraft, who apparently did not correctly execute the pressurization check on the pre-flight checklist. Not the ground staff who prepared the aircraft for Flight 5 Not Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten. Not First Officer Pampos Charalambous, who both looked at the pressurization panel before takeoff and apparently did not recognize or did not register that the switch was in the wrong position. One switch in the wrong position. Missed by everyone who looked at it. The aircraft was released for service at 3:15 in the morning on August 14th, 2005. Part 3. Captain Merton and First Officer Charalambous. The crew who would fly Flight 5 arrived at the Helios Airways Operations Center in Larnaca before 5 in the morning. Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten was 59 years old, a German pilot with a long career that included years flying for Interflag, the flag carrier of East Germany, before reunification ended that airline's existence. He had subsequently built a career flying on contract for various carriers, eventually ending up at Helios. His colleagues described him as quiet, professional, and experienced. He had nearly 9,000 hours on the Boeing 737 specifically. First Officer Pampos Charalambous was 51 years old, a Cypriot pilot who had been flying with Helios for 5 years. He had 7,549 total flight hours. Together they had nearly 25,000 hours of experience between them. This was not a green crew. This was not two young pilots on their first long-haul assignment. These were experienced professionals who had done this route, this aircraft type, this pre-flight routine hundreds of times before. The flight plan was straightforward. Depart Larnaca at 0900, fly to Athens, offload 67 passengers, take on new passengers, continue to Prague. Total block time, approximately 4 hours. Nothing unusual, nothing demanding. A routine early morning departure on a clear August day at 0607, 7 minutes behind schedule. Helios Flight 522 rotated from runway 22 at Larnaca International Airport and climbed into the Mediterranean morning. The pressurization switch was in manual. Merton, Charalambous, and the 115 people behind them had no idea that the air around them was already beginning its slow betrayal. 4 minutes after takeoff, as Flight 522 climbed through 10,000 feet, a warning horn began sounding in the cockpit. This is the moment that defines the entire accident. This is the fulcrum. Everything before this moment is prelude, and everything after it is consequence. What happened in the next few minutes in the cockpit of 5 Bravo Delta Bravo Yankee determined the fate of everyone on board. The warning horn that sounded was a dual-purpose horn on the Boeing 737-300 series. It was designed to sound under two completely different circumstances. First, if the aircraft attempted to take off in an incorrect configuration, such as with the flaps not properly set, and second, if the cabin altitude climbed above 10,000 feet, indicating a pressurization problem. The two triggers for the same horn sound different in their timing and context. A takeoff configuration warning sounds on the ground, during the takeoff roll. A cabin altitude warning sounds in flight, after the aircraft is already airborne. After the aircraft is already airborne. The horn began sounding but 4 minutes after takeoff, while the aircraft was climbing through 10,000 feet. By the logic of timing and context, there was only one explanation. The cabin was not pressurizing correctly, and the cabin altitude was rising. But there was a complication. The morning sun was streaming into the cockpit from a low angle, as it does from those slit-eyed departures, when you are flying generally northwest from a Mediterranean island. And on the pressurization panel of the Boeing 737-300 series, there is a small indicator light. A small green light that, when illuminated, tells the crew that the pressurization system is in automatic mode. When extinguished, it indicates that the system is not in automatic, that manual intervention may be required. In the glare of the morning sun, that small green light was difficult to see. Merton contacted the ground engineer at Larnaca on the company radio frequency, not the air traffic control frequency, he asked, in a tone that investigators later described as calm and businesslike about the warning. The takeoff configuration warning is on, he said. What does it mean? This sentence, captured on the cockpit voice recorder and analyzed word by word in the accident investigation, is simultaneously heartbreaking and diagnostic. Merton believed he was hearing a takeoff configuration warning, not a cabin altitude warning. Two different emergencies, two different sounds from the same horn. He had identified the wrong one. Suffer. The ground engineer on the other end of the radio, who could not see the cockpit, could not see the pressurization panel, and could not hear the exact character of the warning horn, had no way to know that Merton had misidentified the alarm. He confirmed that the takeoff configuration warning should not be sounding in flight, and began walking through possible explanations. The conversation was calm, professional, and focused entirely on the wrong problem. At this point, the cabin altitude was continuing to rise, the aircraft was climbing, the pressurization system, stuck in manual and not set to maintain cabin pressure, was not compensating. The thin air of the upper atmosphere was slowly replacing the thicker air in the cabin. The passengers and crew had oxygen masks available. When the cabin altitude climbed above 14,000 feet, the oxygen masks would drop automatically from the overhead compartments. But those passenger oxygen masks, which most passengers believe will save them if the cabin depressurizes, are not what most people think they are. They are connected, not to pressurized oxygen tanks but to chemical oxygen generators, devices that produce oxygen through a chemical reaction. Each generator provides approximately 12 minutes of oxygen supply, enough time to descend from cruise altitude to 10,000 feet in a normal emergency descent. 12 minutes. That is the full extent of the passenger oxygen supply on a Boeing 737. 12 minutes of chemical oxygen, enough for an emergency descent, not for 2 hours of level cruise at 34,000 feet. The flight continued to climb. Part 5. Hypoxia. There is a reason that pilots are trained to treat pressurization emergencies with absolute urgency, with the kind of immediate and unrelenting action that overrides every other consideration. That reason is a condition called hypoxia. Hypoxia occurs when the brain is deprived of sufficient oxygen. At altitude, as cabin pressure drops, the concentration of oxygen in the air decreases. The brain, which requires a continuous supply of oxygen to function, begins to malfunction. First comes a subtle impairment of judgment, a slight dulling of the mental edges that the affected person almost never notices, because hypoxia impairs the very faculties needed to recognize that hypoxia is occurring. Then comes a feeling of warmth, of well-being, sometimes of euphoria. The fingers and lips begin to tingle. Movements become sluggish. Thinking becomes slow, then unconsciousness. The insidious quality of hypoxia, the quality that makes it so dangerous, is that it is pleasant. People do not feel themselves dying. They feel comfortable. They feel relaxed. They may feel in the final moments before they lose consciousness, better than they have felt all day. Does not generate the sensation of suffocation. It simply dims, like a light on a rheostat being slowly turned down. Captain Merton and First Officer Charalambous, their judgment already compromised by the rising cabin altitude, their attention focused on the wrong alarm, their instruments telling them one story while the air around them was telling another, did not execute an emergency descent. They continued to climb.
Distant lanes.
They continued to discuss the takeoff configuration warning with the ground engineer. They continued in the calm and professional tone of experienced pilots, dealing with what they believed was a minor anomaly, to troubleshoot the wrong problem. At approximately 6:22 in the morning, 14 minutes after takeoff, the cockpit voice recorder recorded the captain's final words in communication with the ground. "Where are my equipment cooling circuit breakers?" the ground engineer told him. Behind the captain's seat. These were the last words Merton ever spoke. The aircraft climbed to its cruise altitude of 34,000 feet. The autopilot leveled it off and maintained it on the programmed course toward Athens. In the cabin, the oxygen masks had dropped. 115 passengers, awakened from their morning drowsiness by the clatter of descending mask panels, had grabbed the masks and breathed the 12 minutes of chemical oxygen. Then the generators had run out, and the passengers had gone to sleep. In the cockpit, the two men with 25,000 hours of experience between them had also gone to sleep. The aircraft flew on alone. Part 6. The ghost flight. What followed over the next 2 hours is one of the most haunting sequences in the history of commercial aviation. Nicosia Area Control Center, the air traffic control facility handling Flight 5 Watwu, began losing contact with the aircraft at around 9:30 in the morning. They called repeatedly on the assigned frequency. No response. They tried the emergency frequency. No response. They contacted other aircraft in the area and asked them to relay messages. The other aircraft relayed the messages. No response. At 9:37, Flight 5 Watwu passed from Nicosia airspace into Athens airspace without making the required radio call. Athens Control made 19 separate attempts to contact the aircraft between 10:12 and 10:50. No response. At 10:40, Flight 5 Watwu reached the key navigational beacon, the fix for the Athens holding pattern, and the autopilot, following its programmed flight plan, began the holding pattern. The aircraft entered a slow, obedient circle at 34,000 feet over the Aegean, waiting for the clearance to continue that would never come. It circled for 70 minutes. The Greek Air Force scrambled two 16 fighters from near Anchialos Air Base to intercept the aircraft and investigate. They found it at 11:24, still flying its holding pattern, still at 34,000 feet, still responding to no radio calls and no visual signals. The F-16 pilot described what he saw through the cockpit glass of the Boeing 737 with the quiet precision of a military aviator trained to report without embellishment. First officer slumped over the controls. Captain's seat vacant. Several passengers visible in the cabin, seated motionless, wearing oxygen masks. He also noted something else. Something that, in the account of the investigation, is mentioned almost as an aside, but that strikes everyone who reads it with a force that is difficult to articulate. Some of the passengers were sitting in what appeared to be normal positions, not slumped, not contorted, sitting as if asleep, as if they had simply closed their eyes, because that is what hypoxia does. It does not cause suffering, it causes sleep. For 70 minutes, the Boeing circled. For 70 minutes, the 16 pilots flew alongside it, watching it, calling to it, trying everything they had been trained to try. For 70 minutes, 121 people were alive but unconscious inside a perfectly functioning automated aircraft, and there was nothing anyone could do. Then, at 11:49 in the morning, a cockpit door opened. He sat down the captain leeches. He sat down in the captain's seat, and then his portable oxygen set ran out, or perhaps the aircraft had already descended enough that the oxygen concentration was partially adequate. Whatever the reason, the F-16 pilot, who was watching the cockpit at that moment, reported something remarkable. For a brief instant, the figure in the captain's seat appeared to acknowledge the fighter jet's presence. A hand motion, something between a wave and a gesture of recognition. Then, 49 seconds after prodromou entered the cockpit, the left engine flamed out. The fuel that had been sustaining the autopilot's obedient circles for the past several hours had finally run out. With the left engine gone, the aircraft began to descend. Prodromou did the only thing he could do. He transmitted a distress call on the radio. His voice was picked up on the cockpit voice recorder with startling clarity in those final minutes. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Helios Airways Flight Fivetwatwu, Athens. There was more, but it was unintelligible. A few seconds later, another transmission, weaker. Mayday, Mayday. The radio was still tuned to the Larnaca frequency. Athens Control, who was the entity that could actually help, never received the transmissions. 10 minutes after the left engine flamed out, the right engine also stopped. The aircraft was now a glider, a very heavy, very fast glider, descending toward the hills of eastern Greece. The F-16 pilot reported something in his final observations of the aircraft that investigators noted carefully in the accident report. We suffer from those slit-eyed leeches. The manner in which the Boeing 737 impacted the ground appeared to indicate that the person in the captain's seat had attempted, in the very last seconds of the flight, to level the wings and reduce the angle of impact. Whether this was a deliberate attempt to improve the survivability of the crash, whether it was a trained pilot's last instinct taking over, or whether it was simply a coincidence of aerodynamics, cannot be known. At 9:03 and 32 seconds, Flight Fivetwatwu hit the hillside near Grammatiko village, Greece, approximately 33 kilometers northwest of Athens International Airport. All 121 people on board were killed. Part 8. The investigation. The investigation into Helios Airways Flight Fivetwatwu was conducted by the Hellenic Republic's Air Accident Investigation and Aviation Safety Board, with support from multiple international agencies and Boeing. The findings, when they came, were comprehensive, damning, and deeply instructive. The non-volatile memory of the aircraft's systems was recovered from the wreckage and provided the clearest possible answer to the central question. Where was the pressurization switch? It had been in the manual position throughout the entire flight, from before takeoff until the moment of impact. This finding established the chain of causation with unusual clarity. The ground engineer, Alan Irwin, had set the switch to manual for the pressurization leak check and had not returned it to automatic. The flight crew had missed it on multiple occasions. The Boeing 737's pre-flight checklist contains a specific item for the pressurization system. At step 12 of 15 in the pre-flight sequence, suffer from those slit-eyed leeches. The captain challenges and the first officer responds with a check of the air conditioning and pressurization settings. If this step had been properly executed, with both pilots actively verifying the switch position, the switch in the wrong position would have been discovered. Investigators could not determine whether the crew had orally executed this checklist item because the cockpit voice recorder captures only the last 30 minutes of a flight, and the pre-flight period had been overwritten by the time the recorder was recovered. But they noted, in careful language, that the correct execution of Step 12 would have been the second opportunity, after the ground engineer's failure, to catch the problem before it became fatal. There had also been a third opportunity, the after-start checklist, which includes another pressurization check, and a fourth, the after-takeoff checklist. 4 opportunities, 4 separate moments when 2 trained, experienced pilots following standard operating procedures should have looked at that switch and noticed it was wrong. All 4 were missed. The investigation did not conclude that the crew was negligent or incompetent in the ordinary sense. What it found was more troubling and more instructive. The crew had likely performed these checklist items mechanically, in the way that very experienced pilots performing very familiar procedures sometimes perform them, without the active engaged verification that makes a checklist genuinely effective rather than merely procedural. They had looked at the panel, they had said the words, they had not truly seen what was in front of them. This phenomenon, in the language of aviation human factors, is called a checklist trap. It is the dark side of experience. Investigators identified a second critical failure in the confusion over the warning horn. Slit-eyed leeches. The dual-purpose nature of the Boeing 737's cabin altitude and takeoff configuration warning had been a known issue in the aviation safety community for years before the Helios accident. The sounds were similar enough, and the context potentially similar enough, that confusion was possible. Possible, it turned out, in exactly the most dangerous way. Merton, hearing the horn in the early minutes of the climb, had identified it as a takeoff configuration warning rather than a cabin altitude warning. This misidentification was not unreasonable given his state at the time, his judgment already subtly degraded by the rising cabin altitude, the morning sun obscuring the panel lighting, the routine confidence of a man who had performed this departure hundreds of times. He called the ground engineer. He troubleshot the wrong problem. He continued to climb toward the altitude, at which hypoxia would become incapacitating. The investigation noted that Boeing had known for years that the dual-purpose horn presented a confusion risk. The company had published guidance materials addressing the potential for misidentification, but no mandatory training requirement had been established to ensure that flight crews specifically practiced the guidance the difference the specific 2 warning triggers. The guidance existed. The specific training did not. Following the Helios accident, the Federal Aviation Administration issued an Airworthiness Directive requiring Boeing 737 variants from the 100 to the 500 series to install additional warning lights that would visually differentiate between the 2 warning scenarios, giving the crew a clear visual indication of which alarm was actually sounding. This directive applied to every original and classic series 737 in service worldwide. The change was obvious in retrospect. It required an accident that killed 121 people to make it mandatory. Part 9. The company and the system. The investigation did not stop at the aircraft or the crew. It reached further into the organization that had operated the flight and the regulatory environment that had overseen it. Helios Airways' safety culture received detailed scrutiny. Investigators found that the airline's operational standards, while formally compliant with Cypriot regulations, had features that created conditions for exactly the kind of error that caused the accident. training records for the crew contained gaps and inconsistencies. The airline's oversight of its maintenance contractors was described as inadequate. Suffer from those slit-eyed leeches. The repeated pressurization complaints and the 7 separate inspections in the weeks before the accident had not been treated as a pattern requiring escalated investigation. They had been treated as a series of isolated incidents, each addressed individually and then closed. The Cypriot Department of Civil Aviation, which was responsible for overseeing Helios, came under scrutiny as well. Investigators, and subsequently prosecutors in both Greece and operations, concluded the regulator had not provided sufficient oversights of systemic safety issues, and had not responded adequately but in evidence of systemic safety issues, and had not ensured that Helios pilots' Helios standards met the required aviation standards in all relevant areas. Helios Airways suspended operations in 2006 when Cypriot authorities froze the company's assets. In 2008, we suffer from those slit-eyed leeches. The airline and 4 of its officials were charged with 119 counts of manslaughter, as well as charges of causing death by recklessness and negligence. These prosecutions were the result of political and public pressure in the aftermath of an accident that had killed primarily Cypriot and Greek nationals in Greek airspace. The ground engineer who left the switch in the wrong position was not a criminal. He was a human being who made a human error, an error made more likely by the ambiguity in the maintenance procedures, from those slit-eyed leeches, by the lack of a structured final verification step in the pressurization leak check procedure, and by the ordinary tiredness of a man working in the middle of the night. The flight crew who missed the switch position were not criminals. They were experienced professionals performing familiar procedures in conditions that made careful attention more difficult, warned by a horn they misidentified, impaired by the very substance they did not know was depleting. The system was criminal. The accumulation of inadequacies, the maintenance procedure without a verification step, the checklist performed as ritual rather than tool, the dual-purpose warning horn without adequate crew training, suffer from those slit-eyed leeches. The regulatory oversight that had not caught the pattern of complaints, that had not escalated the concern about pressurization anomalies. This is what killed 121 people. Not one man, not 2 pilots, not one forgotten switch. A system. Failing, as systems fail, not all at once but piece by piece, in ways that had been present and survivable for years, until the morning they all aligned. Part 10. Andreas Prodromo, and the question we cannot answer. In the aftermath of Flight Fivtwatwo, the story of Andreas Prodromo became the most debated element of the accident. His family, his colleagues, and much of the Greek remembered as a hero. The official accident report was more careful. Investigators concluded that Prodromo's intention, while extraordinary and to alter the outcome, were insufficient to alter the outcome. He was not trained on the Boeing 737. He had no experience managing a dual-engine flameout or an unpowered emergency descent in a large transport aircraft. By the time he entered the cockpit, slit-eyed leeches, the aircraft had only minutes of fuel remaining, and the situation had almost certainly progressed beyond any possibility of a survivable outcome even for a fully qualified and current 737 captain. Whether he understood it is not known, says. Whether he made his mayday calls knowing they would not be received, and continued anyway, cannot be established from the evidence. What investigators noted, with a caution born of professional training in the precise language of evidence, was that the final movements of the aircraft before impact appeared consistent with an attempt to manage the crash rather than simply fall into the ground. This much is certain. Andreas Prodromo used his portable oxygen supply to remain conscious while everyone around him died, moved through a cabin full of the unconscious and the dead, opened a cockpit door onto a scene of absolute catastrophe, sat down in a seat he was not qualified to occupy, and transmitted a mayday call that nobody received. He was 26 years old. Whatever the technical analysis concludes about the sufficiency of his actions, the question of what it means to attempt the impossible in the final minutes of your life, to act when action cannot succeed, because action is what the moment demands of you, that question is not a technical one. It does not belong to the accident report. It belongs to the rest of us. His fiancée, Harry Charalambous, was also a flight attendant. On Flight 582, she was among the dead. We do not know if he knew this when he opened the cockpit door. Part 11. What changed? Commercial aviation did not, after the Helios accident, become a different industry overnight. Safety improvements do not work that way. They are slow, systematic, resistant to the pressures of cost and convenience, and dependent on the willingness of an industry to face uncomfortable truths about itself. But some things did change. The most immediate and concrete change was the FAR Airworthiness Directive, requiring additional visual warning differentiation on the Boeing 737 Classic series, the new lights, installed in cockpits around the world, give pilots an unambiguous visual signal when the cabin altitude warning is the active alarm, distinct from the takeoff configuration warning. This modification has been credited by Boeing and the FAR with reducing the likelihood of the specific misidentification that killed Merton and Charalambous. Training changes followed as well. The Helios accident was incorporated into pressurization emergency training for Boeing 737 crews across the world. The specific scenario: a pressurization switch left in manual by maintenance, generating a cabin altitude warning that is confused for a takeoff configuration warning, is now a standard simulation exercise for 737 type ratings. Hundreds of thousands of pilots have now practiced. In the controlled environment of a flight simulator, the precise situation that the crew of Flight 582 encountered for the first time on a real aircraft at cruise altitude with no preparation. The implications of the accident for checklist discipline also entered the training canon. The Helios case is now taught in crew resource management courses as a definitive example of what happens when experienced crews perform checklists ritually rather than actively. But that checklists only work when the people running them are genuinely checking rather than confirming. The investigation's findings about the dual-purpose warning horn contributed to a broader industry discussion about cockpit alarm design philosophy. Modern aircraft, including the Boeing 737 MAX and the Airbus A320 family, incorporate increasingly sophisticated alarm systems that are designed to minimize ambiguity, to identify the source and nature of the problem rather than simply alerting that a problem exists. The human factors research that informed these designs drew directly on the lessons of accidents like Helios 582. The regulatory failures identified at Helios and in the Cypriot Department of Civil Aviation contributed to broader discussions within the International Civil Aviation Organization about the standards required of national aviation authorities overseeing small and mid-size carriers. The pressure on budget airlines to minimize costs while maintaining safety compliance was not unique to Helios. And the recognition that regulatory oversight needed to be more active and more skeptical in this environment influenced safety management frameworks in multiple European jurisdictions. None of these changes, taken individually, is sufficient compensation for 121 lives. Aviation does not claim that they are. What aviation claims, with the quiet confidence of an industry that has bent the historical curve of accident rates consistently downward for 60 years, is that the work matters, that each accident analyzed rigorously, each lesson extracted carefully, each change implemented systematically, makes the next accident slightly less likely. It is not a satisfying claim in the face of any specific tragedy. It is true nonetheless. Epilogue: a hill in Greece. The site where Helios Flight 582 came to rest is in the rolling hills near the village of Grammatiko in eastern Greece, approximately 33 kilometers from Athens International Airport. It is not of dramatic landscape that tourists drive through on their way to somewhere else. Scrubby hills and dry earth. Scrubby hills and dry earth and the smell of time and dust in August. A memorial slit-eyed there. Now, it is visited by the families of the dead, by aviation professionals who come to understand, by people who have read the accident report and need to stand somewhere real. The 115 passengers included 93 adults and 22 children. The youngest was a child. Among the passengers were 103 Cypriot nationals and 12 Greeks, people of the Eastern Mediterranean going home or going visiting, doing what millions of people do every day without thinking about it. The 6 crew members included Andreas Prodromou and his fiancée Haris Charalambos, who've never made it to their wedding. It included Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten, a German pilot who had built his career in the difficult years after German reunification and ended it on a summer morning over the Aegean, hearing a warning he had heard too many times before to hear it with fresh ears. What the accident tells us, in the end, is nothing that aviation does not already know, but occasionally needs to be reminded of. The sky does not forgive small errors any more than it forgives large ones. Familiarity is not knowledge. A checklist spoken is not a checklist performed. A warning heard is not a warning understood. And somewhere in the distance, always, there are the things the system has not yet imagined. The switch left in the wrong position, the morning sun at the wrong angle, the horn that sounds for 2 different reasons, the young man with a pilot's license and a portable oxygen set who is the last person left standing and who opens a cockpit door onto the end of the world and sits down anyway, All 121 of them. Helios Airways Flight Fivitwatwu, August 14th, 2005. The ghost plane that nobody could wake up.